History remembers him as the monarch who authorized the most influential English translation of the Bible, the ruler who united the crowns of England and Scotland, and the intellectual who penned treatises on divine kingship. But what if I told you that King James I harbored desires so scandalous, so politically explosive, that they nearly brought down the British monarchy itself? While schoolchildren learn about his religious contributions and political achievements, the textbooks conveniently omit the passionate love affairs, the midnight rendezvous in royal chambers, and the beautiful young men who wielded more power than Parliament. This is the story they don't want you to know about one of Britain's most consequential monarchs. For over 4 centuries, historians have whispered about the intimate relationships that shaped not just a king's personal life, but the very foundations of English government. These weren't mere friendships or political alliances. These were love stories that toppled nobles, enriched families overnight, and created constitutional crises that echo through modern politics. In an era when a single misstep could mean execution, James I dared to love openly. His choices would transform the nature of royal power, create new pathways to political influence, and establish precedents that modern democracies still grapple with today. The question isn't whether these relationships existed, but how they fundamentally altered the course of British history. The Scottish castle walls seemed to echo with whispers even before young James Charles Stewart drew his first breath in 1566. Born into a world where survival meant mastering the deadly game of court politics, he would learn early that love and power made dangerous companions. His father, Lord Darnley, met his end in spectacular fashion when James was barely 8 months old. The official story spoke of an explosion at Kirk O'Field, but the real cause of death told a different tale entirely. Darnley's body, found mysteriously unharmed in a garden some distance from the blast, bore the telltale marks of strangulation. Someone wanted him dead badly enough to stage an elaborate cover-up. His mother, Mary Queen of Scots, fled south seeking sanctuary from her cousin Elizabeth I, only to spend 19 years imprisoned before losing her head to the executioner's blade. Young James learned his first crucial lesson about monarchy. Even royal blood offered no protection against political necessity. Scotland in James's youth was a cauldron of religious warfare. John Knox's Presbyterian reformers battled Catholic loyalists while witches were burned and conspirators hanged. The boy king witnessed more political violence before his 12th birthday than most men experience in a lifetime. These early traumas would shape his understanding of power, loyalty, and the terrible isolation that comes with absolute authority. But it was in the classroom where James discovered the intellectual framework that would justify his later romantic choices. His tutors, among Europe's finest scholars, introduced him to the classical traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. There, in the writings of Plato and Plutarch, he found celebrated examples of intense masculine bonds that transcended mere friendship. The ancient world didn't view passionate relationships between men as aberrant or shameful. Instead, these connections represented the highest form of human relationship, combining emotional intimacy with intellectual partnership. For a brilliant but socially awkward young king struggling with physical limitations that made him appear ungainly and awkward, these classical models offered an attractive alternative to the conventional expectations of royal marriage. By adolescence, James displayed the contradictions that would define his reign. Intellectually gifted beyond measure, he could debate theology with bishops and compose poetry that rivaled the age's finest verse. Yet he struggled with basic social interactions, his tongue seeming too large for his mouth, creating a pronounced lisp that became more noticeable when emotions ran high. Contemporary accounts describe a king who walked with an unsteady gait, as if constantly on the verge of falling, and who drooled when excited. Yet those who witnessed his intellectual prowess recognized genius. He spoke multiple languages fluently, authored influential treatises on political theory, and demonstrated a grasp of statecraft that amazed seasoned diplomats. These early experiences taught James that traditional masculine ideals of physical prowess and martial valor would always elude him. Instead, he would find strength in intellectual achievement and emotional connection. The stage was set for relationships that would shock his contemporaries and reshape English monarchy. In 1579, a figure entered the Scottish court who would forever alter the trajectory of James's life and understanding of love. Esmé Stewart, Earl of Lennox, arrived from France carrying himself with a continental sophistication that immediately captivated the 13-year-old king. At 37, Stewart represented everything the isolated young monarch had never experienced. Where Scottish nobles approached him with formal deference that barely masked obvious ambition, Stewart seemed to offer genuine affection unmarked by political calculation. The Frenchman brought gifts of books and artwork, stories of the wider world beyond Scotland's turbulent borders, and most importantly, intellectual stimulation that the teenage king craved. The attraction was immediate and overwhelming. James began composing sonnets in Stewart's honor, verses that revealed a passion transcending conventional friendship. "Since thought is free, think what thou wilt," he wrote, "but be secret, and think none ill." The poetry spoke of devotion that dared not speak its name, of longing that must remain hidden from hostile eyes. Other poems from this period describe sleepless nights spent thinking of Stewart, jealousy when the Earl conversed with other courtiers, and desperate pleas for reassurance of continued affection. These weren't formal dedications from monarch to subject, but intimate expressions of a heart completely given over to desire. The physical manifestations of James's devotion shocked even the relatively permissive standards of Renaissance court culture. He would touch Stewart's hand during council meetings, lean against him during public ceremonies, and adjust the older man's clothing with intimate familiarity that left observers buzzing with scandalized whispers. Foreign ambassadors included detailed descriptions of these displays in their dispatches home, clearly viewing them as politically significant rather than merely personal eccentricities. The teenage king seemed incapable of maintaining royal dignity when in his favorite's presence. Stewart's own letters, preserved in French archives, reveal a man walking a dangerous tightrope between genuine affection for James and awareness of the political realities surrounding their relationship. Whether Stewart reciprocated James's romantic feelings or merely exploited them remains debated by historians, but his influence over royal decision-making was undeniable. The Protestant nobility watched this relationship with growing alarm. Here was their young king, heir to John Knox's reformed Scotland, falling under the influence of a Catholic Frenchman whose very presence threatened everything they had fought to achieve. The Earl of Morton and his allies began plotting not just Stewart's removal, but the king's own imprisonment if necessary to break what they viewed as an unnatural and dangerous bond. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and brutal. In August 1582, Protestant lords seized the 16-year-old king during what appeared to be a routine hunting expedition. The Ruthven Raid, as it became known, was nothing less than a coup designed to sever James from his beloved Esmé and force the Earl into exile. For nearly a year, James remained a prisoner in his own kingdom, watching helplessly as his enemies dismantled everything Stewart had built. The psychological impact on the adolescent king cannot be overstated. Confined to Ruthven Castle, cut off from all contact with Stewart, James experienced what contemporary accounts describe as a complete emotional collapse. He refused food for days, spent hours staring toward France where Stewart had fled, and had to be physically restrained from attempting escape. The accusations against Stewart revealed the sexual paranoia that would surround James's relationships throughout his reign. The conspirators openly accused Stewart of seducing James into carnal lust and corrupting the young monarch through wicked and ungodly practices. When Stewart was finally forced to flee Scotland, James fell into a depression so profound that courtiers feared for his life. Letters from this period describe a young man consumed by grief, unable to concentrate on state business, displaying symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe clinical depression. Stewart's death in France, reportedly of fever but possibly by poison administered by Protestant agents, reached James just as he was beginning to assert his independence. The news sent him into another spiral of grief and rage, but also crystallized his determination to escape noble control and accumulate enough power to protect future favorites from similar fates. By 1603, Elizabeth I lay dying without direct heirs, and James of Scotland prepared to claim the English throne that would make him the most powerful monarch in Europe. The union of the English and Scottish crowns fulfilled his lifelong dream of creating a unified British kingdom, but it also placed him under the intense scrutiny of a foreign court notorious for its sophistication and intrigue. The journey south to London revealed both James's excitement at his new prospects and his continued vulnerability to masculine beauty. Among the English nobles who came north to pay homage was a contingent of young men whose looks and manners immediately caught the new king's attention. James's first sight of London overwhelmed him with its size, wealth, and sophistication. Where Edinburgh was a provincial capital of perhaps 30,000 souls, London boasted over 200,000 inhabitants and served as the commercial and cultural center of Europe's most dynamic economy. The English court offered opportunities for luxury, learning, and companionship that dwarfed anything available in Scotland. For a king whose desires ran toward beauty and refinement, it was paradise. Yet it was also a minefield where every gesture would be analyzed, every friendship scrutinized, and every sign of royal favor potentially weaponized by political enemies. James's marriage to and of Denmark had produced the heirs necessary to secure the succession, but courtiers noted that the royal couple maintained separate households and seemed to interact primarily during state occasions, and appeared to understand and perhaps even accommodate her husband's emotional investments elsewhere. Contemporary accounts suggest the Queen formed her own intimate friendships with ladies of the court while James pursued his increasingly public relationships with beautiful young men. This arrangement, unusual by the standards of royal marriage, seemed to work for both parties. The new English court provided James with access to a pool of educated, ambitious, and physically attractive men that Scotland had never offered. Wealthy families throughout the kingdom began sending their most promising sons to seek their fortunes in the royal presence, creating a constant stream of potential favorites. Into this charged atmosphere stepped Robert Carr, a young Scotsman whose beauty and charm would soon make him the most powerful man in England after the king himself. Carr had come south with James's initial retinue but attracted little attention until a riding accident during a tournament in 1607 changed both their lives forever. Thrown from his horse in full view of the royal box, Carr broke his leg so severely that bone protruded through skin, causing spectators to gasp in horror. James, moved by the young man's pain and perhaps struck by his physical appeal even in such circumstances, immediately leaped from the royal box and rushed to Carr's side. Ignoring protocol and his own dignity, the king cradled the injured man's head in his lap while shouting for his personal physicians. This public display of concern for a relatively minor courtier sent shock waves through the assembled nobility, who recognized the signs of royal infatuation from previous experience. As Carr recovered over the following weeks, James began visiting daily, then hourly, seemingly unable to tear himself away from the injured man's bedside. What began as royal compassion quickly transformed into the most intense relationship of James's reign. The physical manifestations of James's infatuation with Carr became the talk of both English and foreign courts. The Venetian ambassador wrote detailed descriptions. His Majesty caresses him publicly and upon the slightest occasion kisses his hands, touches his face, and displays such marks of affection as would be excessive even between husband and wife. The letters between James and Carr reveal a relationship of extraordinary intimacy. James addressed Carr as the man I loved above all men living, language that shocked even the relatively permissive standards of Jacobean court correspondence. When diplomatic business required their separation, James wrote daily letters filled with endearments and complaints about loneliness. One particularly revealing letter contains James's confession. "I cannot content myself without sending you this present, praying God that I may have a joyful and comfortable meeting with you, and that we may make it this Christmas a new marriage ever to be kept hereafter." The reference to marriage between two men was unprecedented in royal correspondence. Under James's patronage, Carr rose from Gentleman of the Bedchamber to Viscount Rochester in 1611, then Earl of Somerset in 1613, accumulating wealth and titles at a pace that left hereditary nobles breathless with indignation. James appointed Carr Lord Chamberlain in 1614, giving him control over access to the royal presence. The corruption surrounding Carr's administration became a source of growing resentment. Parliament members complained they could not present petitions without paying bribes to the king's favorite, while foreign ambassadors reported that English foreign policy seemed for sale to the highest bidder. Yet beneath the public splendor lay a more complex emotional reality. Carr's own letters reveal a man increasingly uncomfortable with the intensity of James's devotion and the expectations that came with royal favor. He complained to friends about the king's possessiveness and jealous reactions to his friendships with other courtiers. The turning point came when Carr became entangled with Frances Howard, Countess of Essex, in one of the most scandalous affairs of the Jacobean era. Howard, trapped in an unconsummated marriage to the Earl of Essex, sought an annulment that would allow her to marry Carr. James's reaction to Carr's romantic entanglement revealed the possessive, jealous nature of his attachment. When Carr began spending more time with Howard and less in the royal presence, the king's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would summon Carr at odd hours for no apparent purpose and demand detailed explanations for his absences. The situation deteriorated when Carr, now thoroughly absorbed in his romance with Frances Howard, began refusing to perform some of the more intimate duties of his position. Most significantly, he stopped sleeping in the king's bedchamber, a privilege he had maintained for several years. As the Overbury murder trial unfolded throughout 1615 and 1616, with both Carr and Frances Howard ultimately convicted of poisoning the knight who had opposed their marriage, James faced the most difficult decision of his reign. His favorite stood accused of cold-blooded murder. James's decision to commute their death sentences to imprisonment revealed both his lingering affection for Carr and his growing recognition that the favorite's usefulness had ended. The king could not bring himself to execute the man he had loved above all others, but neither could he ignore demands for justice. The fall of Robert Carr marked the end of James's youth and the beginning of a more calculating approach to royal favorites. The pattern established with Esmé Stewart had repeated itself with even more dramatic consequences. In 1614, even as the Carr affair was reaching its scandalous climax, fate delivered what courtiers would later call the most beautiful man in England. George Villiers appeared at court with advantages his predecessors had lacked: youth, extraordinary physical beauty, and most importantly, a family ambitious enough to engineer his rise but practical enough to avoid spectacular self-destruction. Contemporary descriptions of Villiers read like romantic poetry rather than court chronicles. Standing over 6 feet tall with perfectly proportioned limbs, golden hair that caught light like spun metal, and features combining masculine strength with feminine delicacy, Villiers possessed what observers called a pleasing manner and graceful deportment that won all hearts. The Villiers family had studied the rise and fall of previous royal favorites with calculating precision. George's mother, Mary Villiers, understood that success required not just physical attraction but political acumen, religious orthodoxy, and the ability to serve the king's needs while advancing broader family interests. Unlike the Catholic Esmé Stewart or the politically naive Robert Carr, George Villiers would be carefully prepared for the role of royal favorite. The family invested heavily in his education and presentation, hiring the finest tutors to perfect his French, improve his dancing, and teach him the subtle arts of courtly conversation. James's attraction to Villiers was immediate and overwhelming, but it was also different from his previous infatuations. Where Stewart had been fatherly and Carr passionate, Villiers seemed to offer something approaching genuine partnership. At 21, he was young enough to inspire protective instincts but mature enough to understand the political complexities of their relationship. Within months of their first meeting, Villiers had been appointed gentleman of the bedchamber, granting him intimate daily access to the king's person. But it was the emotional connection that truly distinguished this relationship. Court observers noted that the king seemed more relaxed and happy than he had been in years. The evidence for the physical nature of James's relationship with George Villiers emerges not from court gossip or enemy propaganda, but from their own correspondence. A letter from Villiers contains a phrase that has puzzled historians for centuries. The bed's head could not be found between the master and his dog. The reference to Villiers as James's dog, a term of endearment the king used frequently, combined with the image of their bodies so intertwined that traditional sleeping arrangements were disrupted, suggests an intimacy transcending conventional friendship. Even more revealing are James's own letters to Villiers, particularly those written in 1624 as the king's health declined. These documents contain language so explicitly conjugal that even sympathetic historians struggle to interpret them platonically. James writes of praying for a joyful and comfortable meeting with Villiers, proposes celebrating a new marriage at Christmas, and most remarkably, addresses Villiers as "my sweet child and wife." The 1624 correspondence continues with James declaring he would rather live banished in any part of the earth with you than live a sorrowful widow's life without you. The use of widow is particularly striking as it explicitly casts their relationship in matrimonial terms while acknowledging that James's actual wife, queen, had died 3 years earlier. The king seemed to view Villiers, not as his true spouse and life partner. Under James's patronage, George Villiers rose to heights that dwarfed even Robert Carr's spectacular ascent. Created Duke of Buckingham in 1623, he became the first non-royal duke in English history, wielding power extending far beyond traditional limits of court favorites. Buckingham controlled government appointments, directed foreign policy, commanded military expeditions, and accumulated wealth rivaling the crown itself. Yet unlike his predecessors, he managed to retain James's absolute devotion while building a power base independent of royal favor. The secret of Buckingham's success lay in his understanding that James needed more than physical companionship or romantic love. The aging king required a partner capable of sharing the burdens of rule while protecting the dynasty he had worked to establish. Buckingham's marriage in 1620 created potential crisis in his relationship with James, who had watched previous favorites drift away as they established their own families. However, Buckingham handled the situation with remarkable skill, including both James and the royal family in wedding preparations and continuing to spend most nights in the king's chambers even after taking a wife. Parliament's growing opposition to Buckingham's power reflected broader anxieties about the nature of royal government under James. Members complained they could no longer distinguish between the king's will and his favorites' preferences, that England's foreign policy seemed designed to serve Buckingham's interests rather than national ones. The relationship between James and Buckingham during the king's final illness reveals the depth of their emotional bond and its political implications. As James's health deteriorated in early 1625, Buckingham essentially took over daily administration while maintaining constant vigil at the royal bedside. Foreign ambassadors reported they could no longer distinguish between royal commands and ducal orders, as Buckingham seemed to speak with the king's voice and authority. Contemporary accounts of James's death describe Buckingham's behavior as that of a grieving spouse rather than a loyal subject. The transition to Charles I's reign revealed the extraordinary institutional changes that James's relationships with his favorites had wrought. Charles, who had grown up viewing Buckingham almost as a stepfather, continued the Duke's unprecedented access to royal power while maintaining their intimate friendship. Buckingham's assassination in 1628 by John Felton, a disgruntled naval officer who blamed the Duke for England's military failures, represented the violent end of an era that had begun with Esmé Stewart nearly 50 years earlier. Felton's act was celebrated in London streets, where ballads hailed him as a patriot who had rid England of its most hated man. The political consequences of James's romantic inclinations extended far beyond personal scandal or court intrigue. Parliament's growing assertiveness during his reign stemmed partly from resentment over the influence of favorites who seemed to wield power without accountability to anyone except the king's personal desires. The constitutional conflicts that would eventually explode into civil war under Charles I had their roots in the Jacobean court's unprecedented mixing of private affection and public authority. The religious dimensions of opposition to James's favorites reflected deeper anxieties about masculine sexuality and royal authority in Protestant England. Puritan critics argued that the king's unnatural relationships with beautiful young men represented fundamental corruption of the godly monarchy they sought to establish. These attacks linked sexual deviance with political tyranny in ways that would influence English political discourse for generations. Continental observers viewed James's relationships as evidence of English political decadence and weakness. French, Spanish, and papal diplomats reported extensively on what they saw as the corrupting influence of sexual passion on English statecraft, often using these observations to justify aggressive policies toward Britain. The financial costs of James's generosity to his favorites contributed to the fiscal crisis that would plague English monarchy for generations. The enormous grants of land, money, and monopolies lavished on Stewart, Carr, and Buckingham drained royal resources while creating resentment among taxpayers. The international implications of James's relationships became particularly acute during marriage negotiations for his children. Foreign courts questioned whether a king so obviously devoted to male companions could be trusted to pursue marriage alliances that served national rather than personal interests. The legacy of James's relationships extended beyond immediate political consequences to influence the cultural and literary development of early modern England. The king's own poetry, much of it inspired by his male favorites, helped establish new conventions for expressing masculine emotion and desire. His court became a center for theatrical productions exploring themes of male friendship, cross-dressing, and ambiguous sexuality that would influence Shakespeare, Marlowe, and their contemporaries. The patronage system James established for his favorites created new pathways to power that bypassed traditional noble hierarchies. Young men throughout the kingdom began cultivating the physical beauty, intellectual refinement, and courtly graces that might catch royal attention. This development had profound effects on English aristocratic culture, encouraging attention to personal appearance and artistic accomplishment previously considered effeminate or foreign. The architectural changes made to royal palaces during James's reign reflected the practical requirements of his relationships with favorites. New chambers were constructed to allow private access between royal and favorite quarters, while existing layouts were modified to accommodate unprecedented intimacy. The scholarly tradition that developed around James's court included numerous works exploring the nature of masculine friendship and its role in good government. Philosophers and theologians produced treatises arguing that intense male bonds represented the highest form of human relationship, while critics countered with warnings about political dangers. The questions raised by James I's reign echo powerfully in today's political landscape. How do we balance the personal lives of public figures with their professional responsibilities? When does private behavior become a matter of public concern? These dilemmas that confronted 17th-century England remain relevant in our modern democratic societies. Contemporary politicians navigate similar tensions between personal authenticity and public expectations. The rise of social media has created new forms of scrutiny that would be familiar to James's courtiers, who lived under constant observation and interpretation of their every gesture. The role of unelected advisors and confidants in shaping government policy remains contentious. From presidential cabinets to parliamentary systems, the influence of those with personal relationships to power continues to raise questions about accountability and democratic governance. James's struggle to maintain meaningful personal relationships while wielding absolute authority speaks to broader questions about power, isolation, and human connection that resonate across centuries. Modern leaders grapple with similar challenges, though in different contexts. The economic implications of James's favoritism, from monopolies granted to personal friends to the financial costs of maintaining lavish lifestyles, find parallels in contemporary debates about government spending, corporate influence, and the proper use of public resources. The international complications created by James's personal relationships mirror modern concerns about how private behaviors of public figures affect diplomatic relationships and national security interests. The interconnected nature of personal and political continues to create challenges for governments worldwide. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of James I's story is not the scandal or political intrigue, but the fundamentally human nature of his struggles. Here was a man born to absolute power who remained subject to the same emotional needs, desires, and vulnerabilities that affect us all. His letters to his favorites reveal not a calculating politician exploiting relationships for advantage, but a lonely individual seeking genuine connection in a world where trust was dangerous and affection could be weaponized. The intensity of his attachments suggests someone who understood that power without love was meaningless. The tragic pattern that emerged throughout his reign, of passionate devotion followed by political necessity and ultimate abandonment, speaks to the impossible contradictions inherent in absolute monarchy. James could elevate men to unprecedented heights, but he could not protect them from the consequences of their own choices or the machinations of political enemies. His determination to love openly, regardless of social conventions or political costs, represents a form of courage that transcends sexual categories. In an age when conformity meant survival, James chose authenticity, accepting the political and personal consequences of his decisions. The education James received in classical literature provided intellectual frameworks for understanding intense male relationships, but the emotions behind his attachments came from more personal sources. His childhood experiences of loss and betrayal created deep needs for connection and security that shaped his adult relationships. The psychological profile that emerges from detailed study reveals someone shaped by trauma but not defined by it. James channeled his vulnerabilities into genuine connections that made him, in many respects, a more effective ruler. His ability to inspire devotion and loyalty, even among those who disagreed with his policies, stemmed from his emotional openness. Modern psychologists might recognize patterns in James's behavior that reflect attachment disorders rooted in early experiences of abandonment. Yet these same patterns enabled the genuine connections that distinguished his court from the cold formality typical of royal households. The Secret Life of King James I forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, sexuality, and human nature that remain relevant for centuries later. His story challenges conventional narratives about monarchy, masculinity, and the relationship between private desire and public duty. James's reign demonstrates that even absolute monarchs remain subject to fundamental human needs for love, companionship, and emotional connection. His refusal to separate his personal needs from his public role created both opportunities and problems that echo through generations. The constitutional changes, cultural innovations, and political precedents established during his reign had consequences extending far beyond his lifetime. The civil war that eventually consumed his son's reign, the transformation of English government, and the cultural flowering that produced Shakespeare's greatest works all trace connections to James's personal choices. Perhaps most importantly, James's story reminds us that history is shaped not just by grand political movements or economic forces, but by the choices of individuals grappling with fundamentally human dilemmas. The king who dared to love openly in an age of rigid convention left a legacy that extends far beyond romantic poetry and passionate letters. His willingness to prioritize personal relationships over political convenience created new forms of government, new cultural expressions, and new understandings of royal authority that influenced British society for centuries. The man who wore all four crowns of the United Kingdom was also a human being who loved deeply, suffered greatly, and refused to compartmentalize his emotional life. In our modern age, when public figures face unprecedented scrutiny of their private lives, James I's story offers both cautionary tales and inspiring examples. His reign suggests that authentic leadership requires the courage to remain human, even when humanity creates political complications. The documents that survive from his relationships, from passionate poetry to intimate letters, provide rare glimpses into the private emotions of absolute power. They reveal that even kings can be vulnerable, that political authority cannot protect against heartbreak, and that love remains one of the few forces capable of transcending the artificial boundaries of rank and station. James I's legacy extends beyond the obvious political and cultural achievements to encompass questions about authenticity, courage, and the price of remaining true to one's nature in hostile environments. His story stands as testimony to the enduring power of the human heart to shape history, even when that heart beats within the breast of an absolute monarch. The king who commissioned the most influential English translation of the Bible also authored some of the most passionate love poetry in the language. The ruler who united England and Scotland also demonstrated that personal relationships could unite or divide kingdoms. The monarch who claimed divine right to rule also proved that even divine authority cannot exempt anyone from the fundamental human need for love and connection. In the end, James I's secret life with his male courtiers reveals not just the hidden history of a particular reign, but the eternal struggle between public duty and private desire that defines the human condition. His story reminds us that behind every exercise of power stands a human being grappling with the same needs, fears, and desires that motivate us all. The crown may confer authority, but it cannot protect the heart. In learning to love courageously despite the consequences, James I left a legacy that transcends the specific circumstances of his reign to speak to anyone who has ever struggled to remain authentic in a world that demands conformity. His reign stands as a reminder that even the most powerful individuals remain subject to the fundamental forces that shape all human experience. In choosing love over convention, authenticity over safety, and emotional truth over political expedience, James I created a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us centuries later. The secret life of King James I ultimately reveals that there are no secrets when it comes to the human heart. Love, in all its forms, will find expression regardless of the barriers society constructs to contain it. His story endures because it speaks to the eternal human struggle to balance duty with desire, power with vulnerability, and public responsibility with private truth. As we continue to grapple with questions about leadership, authenticity, and the relationship between personal and political life, James I's reign offers valuable lessons. His willingness to love openly, despite the costs, suggests that genuine leadership requires the courage to remain fully human, even when humanity creates complications. In an age of increasing polarization and rigid categorization, James's story reminds us that human nature resists simple classifications. His reign demonstrates that effective leadership can emerge from unexpected sources and that personal authenticity, while politically risky, may be essential for meaningful connection and lasting impact. The documents and artifacts that survive from James I's relationships with his male courtiers continue to fascinate historians and the public alike because they provide rare glimpses into the private emotions of absolute power. They remind us that behind every historical figure stands a human being grappling with the same fundamental needs and desires that motivate us all. James I's secret life forces us to reconsider our assumptions about power, sexuality, and leadership. His story suggests that the qualities that make someone an effective ruler may be inseparable from the qualities that make them fully human. In daring to love openly in an age of rigid convention, he created a legacy that continues to inspire courage and authenticity across the centuries. The king who transformed British monarchy through his personal choices left us with enduring questions about the relationship between private truth and public responsibility. His story reminds us that history is shaped not just by political movements or economic forces, but by individuals willing to risk everything for authentic human connection. In the end, the secret life of King James I reveals that the most powerful force in human history may be the simple courage to love authentically, regardless of the consequences. His reign stands as testimony to the enduring truth that even absolute monarchs remain subject to the fundamental human need for genuine connection, and that love, in all its forms, possesses the power to reshape kingdoms and change the course of history itself. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most tragic and misunderstood stories. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. I am dedicated to uncovering the hidden, untold stories in history. Ring that notification bell, because the next untold story will move you more than this. Until then, question the narratives, listen to the silenced voices, and never stop seeking the truth behind the legends.